Chapter 21. Cindy awoke with a terrible headache, knowing there was no possible way she could have drunk that much. It took her a moment to realize that she was on the move, most likely in a carriage. Slowly, her memories began coming back to her. She recalled heading over to the brothel and asking Martha for help. They'd gone out together, leaving for the castle, but they'd stopped in the tavern, and Cindy had been chatting with Charles about Red. Then she'd felt a bit dizzy as she attempted to find the powder room. Her memories ended there, and the pain in her head was mounting. She had a feeling that something was wrong. Then a voice in the darkness startled her.
"Mummy is already planning to punish you for running away. She made a deal with Lowndes, and once you're his wife, he'll lock you up in his farm indefinitely."
She recognized Susan's squeaky voice and noticed that she and Teresa were sitting opposite her. There was also a man in the carriage who appeared to be a huntsman. He glared at her with his beady hazel eyes, and Cindy had a feeling she wouldn't be able to disable him on her own. She'd fought off a few bigger men before, but right now her body felt weak. She pulled herself into a sitting position. Fury rose within her, but she knew she needed to stay calm for now.
"Your mother can't force me to marry Lowndes,"
Cindy snapped. Her stepsisters laughed. Then Susan nudged the man with her elbow.
"Oh, yes, she can, and she will. Mr. Rowling is here to make sure you don't do anything silly. Mummy's sorting out the last bits and bobs for your wedding and welcoming the arriving guests. Lowndes is paying us good money to take you off our hands,"
Teresa sang, and fluttered her eyelashes towards Mr. Rowling, who completely ignored her. Cindy noticed that he had a selection of knives by his side, and realized that now she truly had no opportunity to sneak away.
"In about 2 hours everything will be over. Mummy went to the king, and he offered to find you, but then we received word that you were in the tavern with some prostitute," Susan said, brushing her red hair. "So we didn't need his help after all."
Cindy glanced out the window, realizing that the carriage was moving quite fast. It seemed as though the coachman had been told to hurry up, and she didn't recognize her surroundings. They were undoubtedly halfway to Garland's kingdom already. Cindy could easily deal with her stepsisters, but the huntsman posed a problem. Ida must have returned to Farrington as soon as she realized that Cindy was missing, just as she'd suspected.
"It's not going to happen, my dearest,"
she said, with no small amount of sarcasm.
"No one can force me to say I do." "We'll see about that,"
Susan snapped. There was no point discussing anything with them. Susan and Teresa were dim-witted and shallow. Cindy was looking forward to seeing Ida, because she wanted to inform her stepmother that she no longer had any sort of evidence against her. The painting was now in her possession. Although she was still somewhat worried about Ida's magical powers, she had nothing to lose at this point. The journey was dragging, and her stepsisters were trying hard to gain the attention of the bored huntsman. Her strength was slowly returning, but her hopes were diminishing. Cindy wished she'd walked to the castle without Martha, rather than stopping in the tavern. Caspian could have helped her. Now it was too late for him to do anything. Besides, he had no idea where she was or how to locate her. At least Martha was concerned for her safety, but Cindy suspected that she was no doubt drunk somewhere in the bushes. The carriage stopped an hour later, and the huntsman dragged Cindy out. Ida was waiting for her outside, with her hands clasped behind her back. "I underestimated you, Cinderella. I didn't think you had it in you. No one can run away from their responsibilities, not when I'm in charge," Ida stated, glaring at Cindy with her usual stern expression. Her stepmother appeared relieved, and Cindy wasn't fazed by her stepmother's anger. "And you will be flogged for nearly ruining the wedding."
"Allow him anywhere near me, and you'll see exactly what I'm capable of. My father wouldn't have wanted that kind of husband for me,"
Cindy told her, attempting to pull away from the huntsman's firm grip, but he was much stronger than she'd realized. You're a rotten human being, and you will pay for this, stepmother. Ida shook her head and smoothed her hair. Rowling, take her inside the cottage and keep an eye on her. Additionally, ensure she changes into her wedding dress. We don't want any further delays. Everyone is already waiting for the ceremony to begin, Ida said through gritted teeth, as if she hadn't heard Cindy's insult. You have embarrassed this family enough, and you will go through with it. I'm sorry, Cindy, but you haven't given me any other choice. Cindy opened her mouth to tell her that she wasn't done speaking to her yet, but Ida had already begun to walk away. The huntsman nearly pierced her skin with his sharp nails as he dragged her back to the house. She glanced around the property, not seeing Londus or anyone else outside. She was taken to a small room upstairs where her dreadful wedding dress hung on the door of the wardrobe. You have 10 minutes to ready yourself. Don't force me to rip your clothes off and put that dress on you myself, the man said with a leering smile, as though he was looking forward to seeing Cindy naked. Fortunately, he didn't stay in the room with her, and when he slammed the door behind him, Cindy ran to the window. Her room looked out over the back garden, and that's where she could see the guests had already been seated. Londus was waiting for her at the altar. This was complicating everything, and she had no idea what to do. She planned to remain silent throughout the entire ceremony, unless Ida found a method in which to force her to say yes to Londus in front of the priest, perhaps using her magical powers. Cindy had no idea how far Ida's magic extended, or what she was truly capable of. Her anxiety rose within the pit of her stomach. She was trapped, and she didn't have any of her hunting knives to defend herself. In the end, she slipped the ugliest sin wedding dress over her head, knowing she could still humiliate Ida in front of the guests. At this point, she still wasn't certain how she would accomplish it, but she'd find a way. This was not going to be her life. Her stepmother's magic could only go so far. She'd never witnessed it in all the years since her father's passing. Cindy knew Ida had to have a weakness. She only needed to discover what it was. The banging on the door startled Cindy from her thoughts.
Well, you look poor and uninteresting, Teresa giggled along with her sister. Londus is going to love it.
Let's just get on with this, Cindy nearly growled at them. I really don't want to waste my time. She wasn't prepared to give up without a fight, even if that meant she had to scratch Ida's eyes out or knock her teeth down her throat. Her stepmother wanted a wedding, and that was exactly what she was going to get.
I think Cindy might have already lost her mind. I'm so happy we don't have to deal with her any longer,
Susan whispered to Teresa as she moved past them. Regardless of what happened, she was going to keep her head held high. People needed to see that she was proud of who she was. Her stepmother wanted to see her tormented and miserable, but Cindy wasn't the foolish little girl Ida thought she was. She needed to play into her stepmother's hand right up until the very end. Her stepmother was outside the house, and she handed Cindy a bucket with horrendous, near-wilting yellow flowers without saying a word. It appeared as though no one was going to walk her down to the altar. Many of the guests were turning around. Cindy took a few deep breaths, thinking of what she needed to do. The king, her king, was somewhere out there, and as soon as this farce of a wedding was over, she was planning to head straight over to the castle. She began walking, feeling as if she were in a fog. The wedding guests were staring at her, and several were even smiling. She knew she looked awful. The dress was horrible, to say the least. On top of everything, she didn't know any of the people who'd come to celebrate her special day, and it looked as though the altar was set up right in front of the pig pen. The smell was atrocious, and Cindy couldn't believe this was happening. Over the years, she'd never thought of her own wedding, but this was worse than any nightmare. She approached Londus, who wore a tedious white suit and had a smile plastered across his face. The priest was at least 80 years old and smiled kindly at her, holding a Bible in his hands.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have gathered here today.
She switched off, tuning out the noise around her when the priest began talking, attempting to think of only Caspian. A fierce heat built up inside of her as she was pumping herself with courage. She was in love with the Vampire King, and even if she'd wanted to, she knew she couldn't deny it.
Now it's time for one of the most important questions of the day.
The priest's voice brought her back to the ceremony. Teresa and Susan were giggling away, as per usual, sitting very close. Too close. When she glanced back at Londus, she noticed he was staring at her cleavage.
Will you, Mark Londus, take this woman, Cinderella Rutherford, to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?
The priest first asked Londus. Cindy's heart was racing away, and her vision had gone blurry. She continued telling herself that she could still find a way out of this dreadful marriage. "I do," Londus answered, smiling at her. Cindy felt sick. She was ready to vomit on the priest, Londus's ghastly suit, or his shoes. And that damned pig pen wasn't helping matters. She wanted to run, to get away, to find her king. Then the priest turned to face her.
Will you, Cinderella Rutherford, take this man, Mark Londus, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?"
Strained silence descended around her, and Cindy tried to smile. Everyone was staring at her, and Londus was mouthing in silence, "I do," to her, as though she had forgotten her vows. She was waiting for that tension. She didn't sense any magical energies surrounding her. It appeared as if her stepmother couldn't truly control her. "No, I'm not taking this man as my husband, and you, stepmother, can go to hell," she shouted. Then Ida shot straight to her feet, going pale, and began mouthing something silently. Cindy suspected that she was attempting to use magic in order to force Cindy to say yes to Londus. But then many of the wedding guests began to turn around again, whispering. And then Cindy heard a horse jolting from behind them. She noticed someone galloping toward the cottage on a white stallion. Her heart stopped, and a slight buzzing sound began pounding in her ears. She told herself that she was hallucinating again, because she saw dark hair and a dark cloak as her vampire king tore through the middle of the aisle, then stopped his horse, pulling on its reins. Many of the guests screamed, others gasped, and Cindy stood in the same spot, paralyzed, when her king jumped off the horse, meeting her gaze. "Father, stop this nonsense," Caspian shouted, and then turned toward Cindy. "No one is going to force you to marry this clown."
"My king, this is a private event,"
the priest mumbled, looking confused. "Yes, carry on, father, please. Cindy is just about to marry the love of—" "Actually, I just said no." "Don't dare say another word, woman," Caspian roared, cutting Ida off, who had already begun to stand. "You lied to her and everyone else out here. You are forcing Cindy into a marriage she doesn't want, using blackmail." Cindy placed her hands on her hips and smiled. She was so relieved that Caspian was here that in a way she was a bit annoyed that he'd taken the fun of humiliating Ida away from her. Only a little, though. Heat danced along the surface of her skin. "I know about the stolen painting, and the clause in your father's will about the marriage. One of my men has been following Ida and that clown since yesterday. He overheard her talking about it, and discussing the final payment she would receive from Londus for you. Don't worry, Cindy. You're safe. This entire pathetic ceremony is over." He grabbed her hand and brought her close to his chest. "I think we've all heard enough," Ida snarled. "Cindy is going to marry Londus, regardless of what you may think. My men are here too, and they can ensure that Cindy completes her vows. 4 additional huntsmen stepped in front of her. Cindy hadn't seen them earlier. Tension tightened along the king's frame, and Cindy couldn't believe Ida dared to threaten the king. Didn't she realize she was committing treason against a royal? Perhaps her magic wasn't that strong after all. "Get over here, you stupid girl. We're practically married," Londus shouted, attempting to grab her. But the king stepped forward, blocking Cindy from Londus, and then punched him. The groom went down like a sack of potatoes, falling off the altar. The priest looked bewildered, backing away. "Are you aware that you're challenging the King of Farrington?" Caspian asked, amusement in his tone. All 4 men unsheathed their knives, and Ida smiled. A few wedding guests were whispering, staring at Ida as though she'd gone mad. Ida faced him with a vicious smile. "Too bad you're on your own, my lord. No one should be challenging me, not even the king. Now step away from the girl, or my men won't hesitate to kill you."